Prego la parola al professore, scusandomi un po' forse per la non perfetta pronuncia, salve, professore Joaquín Cayón della Università de Cantabria, e ci parlerà sul tema molto interessante dell'europeizzazione o nazionalizzazione del diritto sanitario, il paradigma della riproduzione assistita. Quindi grazie e do la parola al professore.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I know that it's too late. I'll try to be short. The topic of my presentation is in Italian Europeizzazione or nazionalizzazione del diritto sanitario, Europeanization or nationalization of health law. And I've chosen the paradigm of reproductive care because I think it's a very good field in order to understand what is happening nowadays in Europe. First of all, I want to thank, of course, Professor Carlo Colapietro for his kind invitation to take part in this interesting conference. This is our second time here in University Roma Tre. We are working in a research project with European Commission regarding Europeanization of health law, and it would be my great pleasure to join other universities. So if someone in the room is interested in this kind of research projects, you are more than welcome. Maybe we will be able to talk about it after the presentation. Well, a few weeks ago, I don't know if 2 or 3 weeks ago, you celebrate here in Rome the 60th anniversary of the creation of European Economic Community. And I think that there's no doubt that Europe is in crisis. We are living not only an economic crisis, we are living a crisis of values. And maybe we have to pose again the project of Europe. And it's very likely that we will be able to have to choose between a new Europeization of the European Union law in general terms, or a renationalization. And I want to make a very short reflection about the tools that are being employed by those people who are posing for renationalization of European law in general terms, and specifically on health law. So you know that at the EU level, the main tool for renationalization is the principle of subsidiarity. So national authorities should be preferred in order to implement public policies. And I would like also to talk about a little bit the national margin of appreciation as a public policy in order to allow member states of Council of Europe to implement policies with preference of the national authorities. Well, this is the outline of my presentation. Maybe I will not be able to deliver all the presentation, but at least here you have an outline about the notion and nature of the margin of appreciation, which is very linked to the renationalization of law, the evolution of the margin in the case law of European Court of Human Rights, the margin of appreciation in reproductive care, which is a very specific field where we can easily see how the margin has been evolution, and very recent developments. I'm really worried and a little bit scared with the evolution in this field, because after Brighton Declaration in 2012, we have a new protocol, protocol number 15, adopted in 2015, which is promoting enforcement of the principle of subsidiarity. And finally, maybe we will be able to discuss different arguments for a wider margin or against a wider margin. Okay, you know perfectly well that the margin of appreciation is a jurisprudential creation of the European Court of Human Rights. There were 2 possibilities for European Court: a full review of any national decision or a partial review, and finally the court adopted this solution, just a partial review, which is called so-called margin of appreciation, that can be easily defined as the possibility of the member states of a certain measure of discretion in fulfilling their obligations under the European Convention of Human Rights, Rome Convention. It's very paradoxical, just because all the courts are not mentioning the doctrine of the margin of appreciation. Margin is not mentioned by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Margin is not mentioned in the International Court of Justice. Anyway, at the very beginning, the margin of appreciation doctrine was not dangerous in order to achieve global European goals, just because it was only restricted in case of emergency, time of emergency. You know that Article 15 of the European Convention of Human Rights is allowing states not to fulfill in a wide way the convention in case of public emergency threatening the life of nation. We have many different cases with this close derogation doctrine. The first case was Ireland against the UK. Ireland alleged massive violations of the convention by the UK in the treatment of IRA prisoners. And the court said, okay, I cannot judge this kind of cases because this is a case for national court. The argument was that national authorities, both government and judiciary, are better positions, are better placed than international court. We have now modern cases like the case A and others versus UK in 2009. It was a case of preventive detention of Al-Qaeda terrorists. And in the same way, the court said that this is a national question, so the European Court of Human Rights cannot decide this kind of cases just because it was a case of emergency for the UK. But nowadays we have new cases, and the margin of appreciation doctrine has been extended to personal freedom cases, and this is more dangerous in order to promote a global European project. We have a very recent judgment, the judgment that considered that there's no right of same-sex people to marry. It's the case South and Kof versus Austria, just because the states, the member states of the Rome Convention, have a certain margin of discretion in order to regulate this kind of questions. And also very recently, the court in the case Gaz Dubois versus France adopted the decision of not recognizing the right of same-sex people to adopt, just because there was no discrimination. In French law, it's only possible if you are married. If you're not married, regardless if you are a same-sex couple or not, you cannot adopt people. Okay, some initial conclusions. Then margin of appreciation is typically applied when there is no identifiable European consensus, and the margin of appreciation doctrine has been criticized for its inconsistency and ambiguity. What about the use of this tool in order to allow a new renationalization of a law? You can see in this slide that there are a lot of times that the margin is being mentioned by the court, but not always in the same way. Sometimes the court is mentioning the margin just saying that the states are enjoying a margin of appreciation, other times a wide margin of appreciation, certain margin of appreciation, narrow margin of appreciation. So the margin of appreciation is being presented as a way to make whatever you want. What about the margin of appreciation regarding reproductive care? I think it's a very specific field where we can see how the margin is working in the European Court of Human Rights. You know that when the Rome Convention was adopted, there was no mention to reproduction just because it was in the 50s, and this is what the medically assisted reproduction wasn't possible. But nowadays the court is considering that right to reproduction can be embedded in the right to respect for private and family life settled in Article 8. Article 8 is the star provision of the Rome Convention. But at the same time, we have to be aware that the court has considered that reproductive care is a very relative notion, subject to margin of appreciation. In general terms, the court thinks that when controversial issues are involved, margin of appreciation, national margin of appreciation, has to be respected by the court. So in these cases, the court has a considerable room of maneuver, especially, and this is the words of the court, delicate moral and ethical questions are involved. So, according to the convention case law, it is covered the right to use art for conceiving a child, but it's not covered a right to procreation. You know that in Europe we have a very different legal framework of art, of assisted reproductive techniques, just because we have many different values, many different ethical approaches. In some countries, IVF are allowed, in other countries are banned, insemination solutions, as you can see in this slide. So, what is the position of the court? At the very beginning, the first wave of cases was promoting a European consensus regarding reproductive care, and some national decisions were not allowed by the court because the court considered that the margin was overstepped. There was a violation of Article 8. Very quickly, I will show you some cases. The access of prisoners to art. This was the case of prisoner Dixon, with a 15-year sentence to serve for murder, and he requested to artificial insemination facilities to enable to have a child with his wife. UK authorities refused the application, but the court, and this is the most important of the case, held and considered that there was a violation of Article 8 just because UK arguments were not enough to justify this kind of restriction. We have other cases, very typical Italian cases regarding reproductive care, Costa and Pavan and versus Italy is the case, maybe you know it perfectly well, an Italian couple who are healthy carriers of fibrosis. They wanted, with the help of PGD, to avoid transmitting the disease to their offspring. You know that PGD, at least in that time, is forbidden in Italy in case of fertility. So the only option, the only real option was abortion. So in this case, and this is the most important in order to know how the court is working in this kind of cases, how that there had been a violation of Article 8, just because in this case Italian law was inconsistent because denied the access to PGD, but at the same time this was a case where abortion was allowed. And at the same time the court considered that there was a lack of proportionality. We have a very, very hot case, maybe you know it perfectly well, is the case Paradiso and Campanelli versus Italy. It's a judgment of 2015 that has been recently confirmed by the Grand Chamber in January of this year. This is the case of a baby had been born in Russia as a result of gestational surrogacy. So there was no biological relationship with the child and the parents. When the child came back to Italy, the Italian courts decided in 2011 to remove the child from the parents and to place him under the guardianship of social service. And the argument was that there was no biological link with them. And in this case, the court concluded that there had been a violation of Article 8 just because the Italian argument, the prohibition of surrogacy agreements, could not take precedence over the best interest of the child. That was the argument because the court considered that there was a violation, but it was too late because when the court made the judgment, the baby was adopted in 2013. It's a very dramatic case, and the compensation to the parents for the moral damage was only 2,000 euros. But this is a first wave of cases where the court, or the European Court of Human Rights, was adopting a very European position. But nowadays I want to share with you my worries, my concern, because there's a new wave of, a new set of cases where the court is setting that the margin is not being overstepped. So there's no violation of Article 8. The first case was the withdrawal of consent for using embryos. It's a case Evans versus UK in 2007. Mrs. Evans, who was suffering from ovarian cancer, underwent IVF with her then partner. When the relationship was finished, her ex-partner withdrew his consent for using embryos. So, according to the UK legislation, the embryos have to be destroyed. And what is really important is that the court considered that given the lack of European consensus in this matter, there was a very wide national margin of appreciation, and of course the appeal was not estimated. Another case, and in my point of view this is the most important case regarding national margin of appreciation, is the prohibition of sperm and ovum donation for IVF. This is an Austrian case. Two Austrian couples wishing to conceive a child through IVF needed ovum donation in one case, and in another case donation of sperm. This is not allowed according to Austrian legislation. And finally, the European Court of Human Rights, I am reading their words, said that although there was a clear trend across Europe in favor of allowing gamete donation for IVF, the emerging consensus was not based on settled legal principles. So, and what's really funny is that the court considered that Austrian legislators had not banned individuals to going abroad for infertility treatment unavailable in Austria. So is this promoting reproductive tourism? Is it not a case of double moral? In my point of view, no doubt about it, it's a case of double moral. Okay, you can do it abroad, but you please don't do it at home. This is absolutely incredible in my point of view. So in this case, the national margin of appreciation was recognized, and the court concluded that there was no violation of Article 8. And finally, we have another case, checks before allowing a child who had been born abroad by surrogacy to arrive to the national territory in Belgium. Belgian authorities refused to allow the arrival to its territory of a child who had been conceived by surrogacy. And in this case, again, the applicants invoke Article 8, the right to respect a private family. But again, the court concluded that there was no violation of Article 8 because checks are included in a wide margin of appreciation. And finally, this is the last case, also concerning Italy. We have Parrillo versus Italy in 2015. You know better than me that the Italian law of 2004, I think that there's been some kind of reforms, but I don't know well in which consists of. But Italian law of 2004 prohibits embryo donation for scientific research purposes. And in this case, the applicant complained that she couldn't donate her embryos, conceived throughout, obligated to keep them in a state of cryopreservation until their death. And now the court is also concluding that there's no violation of Article 8 because a wide margin of appreciation, because of the lack of European consensus in this area, cannot allow to extend the domain. So, concluding, we can see that at the very beginning the court was talking about margin of appreciation, national margin of appreciation, okay? But nowadays the court is setting a new principle, which is a wide margin of appreciation. The margin of appreciation for national authorities is wider nowadays than before. And this is not casual. We have the Brighton Declaration of 2012 promoted by the United Kingdom. I think that David Cameron was the Prime Minister when the Brighton Declaration was promoted. And it was adopted in a high-level conference on the future of the European Court of Human Rights. For the attendees of the conference, the margin is a way of dialogue between the national and international court, but we have to be aware that the real goal of this Brighton Declaration is to strengthen the national margin of appreciation. Look at the final statement. The conference welcomes the development by the court in its case law of principles such as subsidiarity and the margin of appreciation, and encourages the court to give great prominence and to apply consistently this principle in its judgments. So, what's been the outcome? We have a new protocol. Many people don't know that there is a new protocol, protocol number 15. It's not been ratified by all the member states of the Council of Europe, because we have to remember that UK is out of Europe after the Brexit, but is still in the Council of Europe, in the Council of Europe. And the new protocol is reaffirming the principle of subsidiarity and reaffirming the margin of appreciation. So, in my point of view, we can discuss if the national authorities should enjoy a wide margin or a narrow margin. There are some arguments for a wider margin: the cultural diversity of the member state of the Council of Europe, reproductive tourism as a safety valve. In my point of view, this is terrible because it's a case of double moral. And in words of Pennings, harmonization could be a wolf in sheep's clothing, more problems than solutions. Of course, as you can perfectly guess, I'm not. My favorite position is against the wider margin. I think there are three main points. First of all, the broad margin, the wide margin involves lack of predictability of the court. We don't know really what the court is going to conclude if the margin of appreciation is very wide. Second, most of cases are inconsistent. And finally, if we conceive reproductive rights as human rights, we have to agree that universality involves a minimum common standards, also regarding reproductive care. So a wide margin of appreciation is going to depend on the economic status of the applicants. So which are the consequences? Reproductive elitism and inequality, because if people have money enough for going abroad to get reproductive care, there's not going to be any problem, but otherwise people with low income are not going to be able to get that possibility. So I promise you to have a short presentation, some concluding remarks. Our proposal is defend defending a narrower margin as a suitable tool for two main goals: ensuring an equitable protection of reproductive rights as human rights, and avoiding unpredictability and ambiguity of the doctrine of the court. And second, we want to make a very short reflection. You know that the allowance of the margin is depending on the European consensus. Okay, we cannot say that there is a violation of Article 8 because there is no identifiable European consensus in this matter because it's very controversial. This is the argument of the court. But I wonder what European consensus is. What's European consensus? What is this? Which are the parameters to measure European consensus? European consensus is a legislative trend. The court said in Sheffield versus UK that it was a legislative trend, but in other judgments the court has said that it's a social trend, and we don't know which kind of percentage is needed in order to recognize a European consensus. And it's very funny because sometimes the court is considering that there is no European consensus, but mentioning legal frameworks of other Commonwealth countries like Canada or Australia. So the conclusion, the remark is that there is no clear test to know what European consensus is. And finally, I think, this is my last slide, that we should promote some kind of harmonization, of standardization, in order to ensure that the universality of human rights, at least at EU level, is the same. I don't know which is the way, maybe limiting European legislation to broad ethical principles. This is quite difficult because, as it was mentioned during this panel, there are many different values in the member states of the Council of Europe. Maybe it could be achieved by avoiding substantive standards in legislation very concerning safety and quality conditions, or promoting self-regulation. Anyway, what's interesting in my point of view is that if we want more Europeanization of the law, we should avoid the EU legal framework. You know that the European Commission has no power in order to promote Europeanization of health policies. So I really rely more in the Council of Europe. I think it's a better base for setting common principles, reducing the inflation of the margin of appreciation nowadays. So this is my last slide. Less Europe involves more margin, or if you want more margin involves less Europe. More Europe involves less margin. If you want less margin implies more Europe. So if we really want to promote a further Europeanization of health law, national margin of appreciation should be reduced. Many thanks.
Grazie professore per questa interessantissima relazione che ci ha spinto sui terreni dell'etica e dei rapporti tra la tutela della salute, l'etica, diciamo, è un aspetto di particolare interesse non solo per la problematica che è venuta fuori dai diversi casi esaminati dalle corti, ma direi anche per questi interrogativi finali che lei ci ha posto con molta intelligenza, appunto sulla possibilità di raccordo tra regolamentazione dei parlamenti nazionali e un qualche nucleo che invece sia una sorta di standardizzazione universale o almeno a livello dei paesi. Ci pone quindi questi interrogativi che nel nostro paese sono anche vicini anche alla dinamica attuale della revisione dei livelli essenziali di assistenza, ma che lei ci ha portato a un respiro più alto e internazionale. Quindi davvero grazie professore. E inviterei allora a intervenire la professoressa Marta Caredda dell'Università degli Studi di Roma Tre. Non c'è? E che ci farà la